Perfect. Thank you all for coming. I hope the sound is okay at home. Let me know if it's not. Let me check the messages. Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm Adriana. I'm the honorary secretary of the YPN. And on behalf of the whole branch, I would like to thank you for being here in person and also at home remotely. This is the second event we're delivering in hybrid since the pandemic. So it's great to see things going back to normal. This, for people that follow us or have been in our events lately throughout the years, you might have noticed this is the first time we do this sort of book club version. We decided to do it based on Bill Gates' book, So How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. This book was published February last year, and it was obviously didn't get unnoticed. I know it was a focus of a lot of reviews and even critics. Despite the critics, we thought the structure was brilliant, and Bill Gates managed to really cover all the main sectors that have the biggest contribute to the emissions and the CO2 we emit yearly. So as in the book, we have the event structure in 2 days, 5 sessions, like the main 5 chapters of the book that represent the 5 main emitters or emission-related sectors. So today we're gonna have the how we plug in with the future of electricity in the power sector. And we're also gonna have how we grow not how we grow things, I should know this, how we make things. So all about the production of steel, iron and plastic and how to go to decarbonize these productions. Day 2, we're gonna have how we grow, how we make, how we move around and how we keep coal and stay cool on heating and cooling industry. So Bill Gates really focused on the solutions, not on the problem. And that's what we wanna talk about in the set of 2 days and all the sessions. And as in a book club, we've invited our guests to discuss and give their opinion and maybe criticize a bit the ideas of the book or not, we'll see. And in a very informal format with no red tape, just a very informal discussion. And we're also gonna open the panel and the floor for discussion. So later in each session, if you have any questions or if you want to challenge the speakers as well, please do. As you might have seen, Inenco is a sponsor for today. So thank you for Inenco. We have Matt here from the YPN, but also from the company representing. And there's a really nice seeds pack for everyone, a pen and a little brochure as well. And thank you for hosting as well, Imperial. But I will personally think that at the end of the event. So let's kick it off. I'm actually going to moderate the session as well, so I'll just exactly.
Should we pick up this?
The what? Yes, please. So this is so people at home can hear us. So if you can pass it around. Yeah, pass it around. Maybe shall we start with you, Roger?
Yes.
I'll ask first if you can introduce yourself, where you work.
I work with you.
Yeah, we work together, Roger and I at Arenco, so that's why it's slightly weird. Where your expertise, where is focus, and where you can bring that knowledge for the power sector session.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. This is cool. So this is my first public speaking event since COVID. So this is great fun to be here. Thanks for inviting us, Adriana. So I'm Roger Hollies. I am the CTO at Arenco, where we build software for controlling energy storage systems, mostly electrochemical batteries at this stage and grid scale. So we control those batteries into markets, and we built the platform to do that. A little bit about my background. I originally studied oceanography and marine biology, always wanted to have an impact on environmental have an positive environmental impact on the world. So originally studied marine biology. And then in 2006, I grew up on a dairy farm, and my dad put up a 6 kilowatt wind turbine on the dairy farm, and I just fell in love with energy. I just looked around and saw that everything was energy, and there were negative consequences in terms of global warming. Even then, very, very well recognized and very hotly debated. But I realized the impact I wanted was in being able to help transform the energy industry. So then In 2008, I absolutely blagged my way onto the Sustainable Energy Futures course here at Imperial as the second cohort, which is great fun. And it's really great to be back here. And then since then, I've been working on innovative energy projects for the last 7 years at Arenco, looking at energy storage. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here to talk about potentially how energy storage as part of a wider mix of solutions can help avoid a climate disaster, hopefully.
Thank you so much. My name is Albena Ivanova. I currently work at Octopus Energy. I'm also very excited to be back here. I was actually taking pictures of the Queen's Tower like an absolute tourist. Considering I spent 4 years on this campus, it's probably going to be deleted straight away. But anyway, I also started kind of similarly in a slightly different career. I thought I wanted to be a biomedical researcher. But my first year at Imperial doing biology and having thousands of hours of lab work absolutely killed that ambition. And I tried to pivot kind of quickly out of that and ended up doing, finished that course and ended up doing a master's in environmental technology at Imperial as well. And off the back of that, landed in Veolia Environmental Services. And my kind of big intro into energy was on an innovation project, where the task was to get the first industrial scale battery for Veolia on the ground and monetize it. And that kind of opened up kind of the world of demand side response for Veolia. And we ended up building a team around that, trying to monetize our other assets. And having been deep in flexibility, I kind of became this innovation project butterfly. So I would kind of go from the next messy project to the next messy project. Ended up doing a lot of electrification of fleets for Veolia. If you don't know Veolia, they're in the UK mainly a waste management company. So there's a very massive fleet and also working with a lot of councils. And off the back of that, I ended up going to Octopus, starting in the electric vehicle department, managing another innovation project focusing on domestic vehicle to grid. Spend a lot of time trying to get assets plugged in and energy flowing out of cars from people's homes. And I currently work in the generation team, trying to get green assets on the ground, mainly wind and solar. And I am soon to be seconded to the high-level climate champions of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to lead their energy strategy for COP27 part-time.
Thanks. I'm Julia Pike, and it's my job to make the next new nuclear power station happen, which is Sizewell C. So what does that mean? It means that I have to agree with government what's the basis for making it economic, how does it fit into the system, what's it going to do? Is it just going to make electricity, or is it also going to sell its heat? Are we going to have heat-assisted hydrogen? We've developed a direct air capture project, heat-powered direct air capture project as part of it. And my journey to doing this, I spent a long time as a lawyer. I was the head of power at Herbert Smith, which is a city law firm. And I did all sorts of projects, so wind, solar, gas, and the tidal lagoon. And I did the work for Hinkley. And one of the things it's impressed upon me is that for any technology to really take off in the UK, you actually have to fit it into the system. You have to fit it into the way government wants the electricity system to be provided, because otherwise it's not economic. And so I look at things very much from that angle. And I'm not a nuclear physicist, so please don't ask me difficult questions about nuclear physics.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I think, well, to kick off the discussion, I would like to ask all of you the way forward, or on your opinion, what's the current status of the power sector and the way to go to decarbonize it. And I think with your quick intros, I think we've all understood that your expertise and your experience focuses on various different technologies. So if you can give an overview of what you think that can be related to those or not.
First. So I think that this book is a great example of just getting engagement, right? And I think despite its critics, and almost because of its critics, it's generating the debate that's required. So fundamentally, humans, we are just extreme consumption, and we're we just consume and generate waste, basically, pretty ugly creatures. And we live in a biosphere, and I always relate things back to biology, which is what we live in. And we live in a quite a finely balanced biosphere, and we constantly push the limits. And in the electrical system, it's particularly like extreme, the amount of energy that we use in comparison to what we can do as physically. I suggest everybody look up a clip that's kind of, you can search in Google, just cyclist versus toaster. You might have seen this, it's an amazing clip, but it just kind of highlights the amount of energy that we use and take for granted. And in a finely balanced biological system, you can't just keep pushing way beyond the kind of extremes of biological systems, because it will push back. And this is one of my warnings, is that we're going to solve this climate problem, but if we don't do it in the right way, we're just going to create another one. So with all the solutions we're looking at, we've always got to keep that in mind. In terms of then how to solve the problem, I think there's two kind of key messages for me. And one is will, and one is diversity. So we need the will to do it, and this is from individual level. Also, there's a section in the book on how individual actions are never going to be enough. We're quite selfish creatures, and when it comes to making the decisions that are going to benefit the greater good, I think on the whole, we're always going to, when push comes to shove, we're always going to go for the selfish option. So whilst that individual will and engagement isn't so important on our own decisions, we can influence like the consumers and choices we make to push for sustainable products. But we're all voters, so we can all vote, and then that can push the government decisions, and then that can push policy, which pushes action. The other side of engagement, personal engagement, is this room's an example of it. There's a room full of, and hopefully a few people watching at home, of people who have engaged their own efforts, and they've taken the decision to dedicate their careers to making a difference and to actually pushing this. So this kind of will and engagement's really important. The engineering solutions to solve this problem aren't horrific. You know, we landed on the moon 50 years ago. This stuff can be done, it just needs the will. And that across all those different levels. So once you realize that this problem's solvable, it's okay, so how do we invest our time and what do we look at doing? This leads on to my second point, which is diversity. There's no silver bullet to this problem, and there's kind of a lot of discussion in this book, and I think he references the Sustainability Without the Hot Air book, which kind of lays this out, that there's no one thing can solve this problem. We need a combination of energy efficiency, yes. We need a combination of renewables, energy storage. Energy storage at the moment is all short term. It's not dealing with the inter-seasonal differences that there are. So we're going to solve this near-term problem and then have another problem. We need some nuclear, although I'm a little bit of an anti-nuclearist, but I think it is part of the mix. Yeah, that's it. I'm far enough away that you can't swing. But there's a lot of talk in the book about fusion. I think Bill Gates is investing in fusion. I mean, fusion has been 40 years away, well, between 10 and 30 years away from being developed for the past 40 years. So whether that's going to change, again, if it comes along, great, but it's not going down a monoculture route. So it's all about diversity for me, making sure you get this diversity of solution. Again, we live in a biosphere. Diversity drives evolution, it drives resilience in face of problems. And the one thing we do know is that whatever solutions we push, the system's going to change. There's going to be different challenges, and it's only through having diverse solutions that you can address kind of an ever-changing world that sits in front of you. So those are my two things. It's all about diversity of solution and the will to get on and do it.
Actually, I would ask the other two speakers if, when you talk about your view of the future, if you can actually touch upon this point, which is, I think Bill Gates really references there, and for him, we cannot wait for the consumer to make the change individually. We cannot wait for 6 million people to go for a utility company that only buys, for example, renewable power. So what's your view on that as well?
Great question. I would also like to talk about comfort. The Economist had a really good article in their latest issue about, we're talking about these grand solutions of building more wind and solar and fusion and basically using technology to solve the problem. and how perhaps partially because of the pandemic, but also because we are selfish and consumerist, we don't talk enough about just doing small changes ourselves, like switching off, turning the thermostat down 1 degree can have really, really big impacts. So I would kind of challenge the room to think about your comfort and what we do to deserve that level of comfort and what we would lose by giving some of it up. I don't think the changes need to be really grandiose, but so I have all kinds of friends. One of my friends has refused to fly for quite a few years now, and she misses out on a lot of birthday parties, but for her, that's worth it. Most of my friends cycle. I also take this discomfort to cycle and challenge myself this winter to actually do a lot more of that than I usually do in winter. But we have an initiative currently at Octopus where we send an email to customers to turn down during 2 hours different parts of the day, and if they reduce their consumption by say 40%, they get their energy for free. And that level of action actually has an effect. People get excited by it, and I agree that we can't wait for the consumer to make that conscious choice themselves. I think we can have more people doing a little bit more of an effort. We shouldn't expect everyone to do it from tomorrow, but doing it in a playful way and communicating change in a more interesting and perhaps less painful way, such as switch off for just 2 hours or reduce by 40% for just those 2 hours. Maybe you're not even at home, but we will give you an award for that, works. The other thing that I want to touch upon, and that's actually also from the vehicle to grid project that I worked on, is data. We kind of took this project and looked from scratch at how can we get vehicle to grid to domestic customers in a small area of the UK, basically from scratch. So building a proposition, giving them the technology, installing it, getting them a car, getting them a new energy tariff. And I think I went into the project with the assumption that we're going to attract a lot of energy geeks. So your people that have driven electric vehicles for ages and have just been waiting for vehicle to grid to come along the way to just grab onto it and go. And I think because of the level of communication and because it was science-based, we actually attracted an incredible variety of participants with this actually extremely new technology. So it's probably pretty unproven, but we attracted and found the number of people that we want for this trial. And what we see kind of across pretty much all of our tariffs, across our trials as a company, is that data is driving change, and that's also very important for meaningful communication to people. I think when it comes to climate change, it's the most unfortunate factor is that it's quite far into the future and people just don't really plan in advance, even to tomorrow. But if we can kind of push through data and show people what the effects are and going to be in the near future and beyond, and keep reminding them of it, is really, really powerful. And the last thing, you kind of alluded to it, is no size fits all approach to let's diversify technology. If vehicle to grid is not for everyone, then maybe an electric vehicle with a smart tariff is a good middle ground or a good starting point. If we can't build wind and solar everywhere, let's think of something else. Let's work more on carbon capture and storage. I'm quite excited about it. From everything I hear, it's probably a decade away to becoming commercially available. Let's push harder on making that a reality. And you're probably going to talk about the financing, but keeping people accountable and keeping financial institutions accountable to where they put their money is something that I want to do more of this year. And again, learning from friends and colleagues that work in that sector, really putting our money where our mouth is when it comes to climate change.
Thanks. So I'd say if there's one thing that people can do, and it's most important, it's to educate yourselves. Obviously, you're all highly educated and educating yourselves, but if you want to know where does your electricity come from, then download electricity map on your phones. If you don't have it and you're interested in energy, you should have it. And you can see from my little picture here that some countries are green, some countries are yellow, and some countries are brown, and some countries are black. And what this tells you is what is it that in an industrialized society makes a green electricity grid, and what is it that in an industrialized society makes a brown or black electricity grid. So what you can see on this today is that France is green. Why is France green? It's got a load of nuclear and some renewables. Why is Scandinavia green? Scandinavia's got loads of hydro. That's great. Some of Scandinavia also has nuclear. So hydro and nuclear, that's very green. Some countries like Iceland have brilliant geothermal, no nuclear, it's very green. So people need to understand what are the resources available to the country and what in that country will make a green mix. And where it's industrialized, an industrialized country, then if you look at Germany, you can see that the German energy policies have been, I think, to say the least, unsuccessful in that they have some of the highest prices and highest carbon in the European Union, whereas France has some of the lowest prices and lowest carbon in the European Union. So it really matters. What you do at an industrial scale really matters. I completely support the idea that people should individually do what they can. I think my only caveat to that really is that we have to be really careful not to leave behind the most vulnerable in society. People who work shifts, people who are not tech savvy, they don't have the same opportunities. And we have to really think carefully about if we're going to pay somebody £1 to plug in their vehicle, whose pound? Well, actually, it's the pound of the other people. So you end up socializing, you can end up, if you're not very careful, socializing electricity costs in a way which disadvantages people who are already at the most vulnerable in society when it comes to energy security. So I'd say absolutely, we need diversity, we need everything. So in the UK, I think we're going to end up with a predominantly renewable mix, predominantly offshore wind, some onshore wind, some solar, some batteries, and some nuclear. The Prime Minister wants about 25% nuclear. I think we need to think really carefully about financing. You know, the more people talk about impact investing. If you're an impact investor and you come along and you invest in a German wind project, what's your impact? Well, it's not reducing carbon and it's not reducing prices. What is your impact? So it's an individually great technology. But when you think about things, you need to think about that impact in the system. You can't only think about, is that in itself a great technology? Otherwise, you end up with the system that you can see. If you look at electricity map on any minute of any day, you can see what is the actual impact of different countries' energy policies. So I'm not in favor of too much nuclear. I'm not in favor of nuclear in all countries, but I'm in favor of taking a realistic view. An industrialized country, where do you get your electricity from today? What is the carbon impact of that electricity? And then making sure that you scale your solutions to your actual need. Because when you don't do that, what you actually do is embed unabated gas. So absolutely, carbon capture storage is very exciting. It might be great. It does also involve importing rather a lot of gas, which, as you can see today, doesn't give you energy security.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I think you've all touched upon the fact that we need diversity. And even though we have that sort of diversity in technology for the power sector, we've touched upon a few technologies that are not developed yet. So, and we've also talked about how to finance those. So what's your way forward in terms of financing these soon to be ready technologies? Who's going to pay for that? Is it the public, the private sector? Obviously, I know this is a whole different debate by itself, but is the government that needs to put incentives for the private sector to invest? What do you think? And which ones do you know that are the most promising in your view? I know fusion is always 10 or 20 years ahead. We can touch upon that topic as well.
Oish. So I think, again, I think it's looking at a variety and a diversity of I've become a bit of a diversity fanatic in terms of like our growth of our company, making sure it's diverse. And I've just seen the value of it in all areas, but just making sure that we're not counting on one area to finance it, because we've seen in the past 2 or 3 years, how many kind of completely disruptive events have we seen that have kind of turned the head on kind of some sectors being able to invest and other areas. So I think we spend a lot of money on energy as individuals. I totally agree with the point of making sure that we protect the most vulnerable. But at the same time, energy for the lucky few, energy doesn't even touch the dial on what we spend, and at the same time it provides us with this superhuman capability. So I think there's definitely a way to try and internalize the externality, like making sure that the bills reflect the cost of the long-term cost of the carbon impacts to get funding there. I think make the engagement piece again is, if we can make this stuff sexy, then the investment from the private sector will come. And again, this stuff it like keeps the world turning. It allows us to do everything that we want to do. Electric vehicles are seeing a renaissance because Elon Musk made them sexy, and that's continuing now through all the manufacturers. And I think how you make your plug socket sexy, I'm not quite sure, but there's got to be a way of gamification. You talked about getting people engaged in their energy use. I think is really important. In terms of the technologies that are coming, I do think carbon capture is an interesting one. I think burning fossil fuels of any sort, regardless of what you do with them, unless they are not fossil fuels and they're kind of synthetic fuels, this stuff is so valuable. It should be treated like gold. The idea of burning this stuff, I think in 20 years' time, people will be looking back going, they were burning this stuff. It's crazy. The energy density, it should be like a precious resource for us. So I think the synthetic fuels route is a really interesting one. I think there is the electrical system as part of the mix, I think is one of the most important ones, because all of the other sections that you're talking about in this series, if you look at it, they all require a really low carbon electricity system. So I think if we can solve this as the core problem, but it is it's very, very tough challenge to do. But I think the electrification of things, I'm a big advocate of it. Interconnectors, infrastructure, batteries as part of that infrastructure, long duration energy storage. I think there's some really interesting compressed air technologies coming online now. There's some really interesting and quite hilarious gravity-based storage technologies. I just would say anybody, go back to first principles, work out how much energy you need in a day and how much weight you would have to lift and how high, just to understand gravity. But there are some really interesting kind of water pressure storage technologies, pumping pressurized storage to the seabed and just using natural pressure differentials. There's all these really interesting engineering solutions that I think just we need to invest in all of them. And the money that's tied up, I think there's enough investment out there, and this is a big enough market in the future for us to be leading this innovation and get there and get some really interesting solutions out of it.
So you also agree that, for example, your electricity bill should have an extra to invest on the long-term investment on the new technology? I
think so. Carefully applied, definitely. I think that's one of the options. But in terms of the long-term investment, the opportunity for the investment and the transition, you look at how much money there is in the oil and gas, and if that can get transferred across to other industries, there's big potential for revenue there for any investor.
Okay.
I think it depends whose money you're talking about. So if you're looking at technologies where there's a clear revenue stream, they're already well developed, then I think it's about getting the trillions of pension fund assets into the right technologies, because electricity is constantly needed, provides a stable income stream, and you can get a long-term inflation-linked investment by investing in offshore wind or investing in nuclear, investing in something that's established and definitely works. I think when you're talking about whose money goes into technologies which are not yet proven, I think that's much more difficult. If you were to put it on the electricity bill, which personally, I'd be perfectly in favour of a levy, but you are requiring somebody to pick who's the beneficiary. So there's something around who's picking the winners. Now, at the moment, a lot of projects are obviously funded by the government's R&D funding, which means that the people picking the winners are the people who award that funding. We have funding for our direct air capture project, for example. But if you and I think lots of other technologies will develop if they can develop sort of at an individual scale. So, Octopus, for example, does fantastic stuff because it's got a big customer base and it can afford to develop within its own profit model things which work well, like vehicle to grid. But on the whole, I think that although it's tempting to think that big money will pour into experimental technologies, I think they won't, because big money wants a return. I think that the government at some point will have to decide to make it an experimental technology sort of effectively mass market by giving it a place in the UK electricity system, and that's what will then get pension fund money behind it, which ultimately is what you probably want for the long run if something's going to operate at an industrial scale.
Excuse me. I don't really work in financing myself, so I think really great points from both sides. What I would say is, having worked on a government funded project, it's a really great way for collaboration and kind of funded government-led, data sharing focused collaboration to look into new technologies. And the target of those trials is always to commercialize and provide a blueprint for others to then do the same. So I'm very pro that kind of innovation, and it's the type of projects that I work on. And what you're saying about pension money, I think money is there. Redirecting the money that is currently going into fossil fuel technology or non-renewable technology is something that we need to do, and we need to provide investors with the incentive to do it. And it comes back to providing bankable revenue streams to technologies. I mean, we've been talking about stacking up ancillary services to monetize batteries since I've been in the sector, which is not that long, but it's a while. It's always a question of where do we get the value out of it. I think we need to monetize flexibility better and stop providing ancillary services and long-term revenue streams for carbon heavy technology. So things like the capacity market and providing long-term contracts for carbon driven technologies should not be the case. We should be supporting and really working hard on the monetization of green tech. We're currently with this vehicle to grid project, even though it's very small, so it's 135 cars, we've managed to convince National Grid to waive their minimal requirement of a megawatt to let us try and get dispatched in the balancing mechanism. And this takes a lot of pushing and a lot of talking about, it's great that you've given us a couple £1 million to work on this technology, but unless you let us monetize it, then we might as well call it just a trial and put a nice report out of it and never have a commercialized case again. So really pushing the distribution network operators to rethink how they finance the grids. Where do we, and actually maybe we'll talk about this a bit later, but when we talk about connecting to the grid, there is a massive cost associated to connecting to the grid. So it's not just let's finance this technology and get it built. Sometimes you can't build technology. And even in the cases of very small tech, so what we were doing with 7 kilowatts, so we're talking about laughable amount on an individual case. We used to have rejected applications for that technology to be connected to the grid because it would cause too much nuisance or potentially a voltage problem. That, to me, it's mesmerizing. So one, the grid needs to be reviewed, and there needs to be additional capacity added and reinforcement work done. Again, it triggers the question of who finances that, because when we had the big solar rollout with the feed-in tariff, a lot of that cost was actually socialized through distribution use of system charges and ended up on our bills. So we need to think about who finances that. But when we talk about who puts the money on the table, well, is our grid ready for that money and that tech to be connected? So there's a big amount of work to be done there. And then there's a big amount of work to be done on the distribution network operator, DNO and DSO side, where we rethink how we look at those players in the market and we push them to put values behind those technologies. So being able to plan for long-term tech like battery storage and having investors reliably see bankable revenue streams for the future. That's my last financing.
It was very interesting because You've also just talked about the current problems we have connecting to the grid, and now this big grid that we already have needs to be reviewed, upgraded, and knowing that all the other sectors that we're going to cover after will rely even more on electricity. This, I think, this chapter actually contributes with 27% of that 51 billion CO2 tons of CO2 emitted will just increase. So I guess the problem will just continue unless we solve all of that. But I was thinking for now, or at least in the next couple of minutes, we can come back to our questions. We can open the discussion from the floor. If you have anything you want to ask related to what we've just discussed or the sector in general.
Yeah,
Matt?
how do you think hydropower will play a role? I think that's got potential in the way that energy storage is being grid. Can it be scaled up recently?
Quick.
What about the efficiency and losses? What are your opinions on that?
Is that for the UK? Maybe to clarify. UK, okay.
Well, for the UK, there's a reason we don't have much pumped storage, and that's because it's not environmentally popular with and there aren't very many places where it would be welcome. That's not to say there aren't places where it could be achieved, but it wouldn't be welcome. And I think this is actually part of a much bigger point, which I think Roger raised at the start, which is around what will people accept. And it's the same point with the grid. What will people accept? You know, we have people who don't want us to build Sizewell C, but many more people don't want Scottish Power Renewables to build a massive substation because it doesn't bring jobs. But they need that for the offshore wind. So, and it sort of brings me back to my first point, which is about people being educated. People can't say they like offshore wind, but they don't like the consequences of needing to bring the power on shore. That's not a thing. Just building a turbine spinning in the sea connected to nothing is not a useful thing. So back to hydropower, I think tidal lagoons, I mean water, if we're going to talk about water power, I think tidal lagoons could work, but it was working on that which actually made me come and develop more nuclear. If you want a tidal lagoon to work, everybody focuses on, can it work technically? Yes, it can work technically. Does it have a policy environment? Which sounds a really boring thing to say. But unless the government has thought through and legislated and worked with the insurance industry to say, if you change tidal flows, what happens if you flood? In the case of Swansea Bay, up the River Usk, what happens? Who's liable? You see how much fuss there is about, I mean, not fuss, I mean, you see how much difficulty there is now for people with flood insurance. Who's taking the liability of climate change leading to greater flooding? The answer is it's not properly worked out. If you deliberately create flooding risk by building a tidal lagoon, for example, you have to have a regime. You may very well want to do it. And there's a bit of a missing link really in government's thinking quite often between, is it a nice thing to have, or in particular to talk about having a tidal lagoon? Can the technology work? Yes. Can you implement that in British society, which effectively you end up damaging the property rights of people who get flooded? No, you can't. So you need years of policy development to make sure that a technology that you bring forward lives properly in the systems within which we live. And I think that when people, and the Prime Minister talks about turbocharging this, that, and the other, you actually have to turbocharge really boring stuff, delivering policy, delivering an insurance solution for your technology. It's boring, but it's actually the bedrock of bringing any of these things to commercial scale.
Albino, Roger, do you have? No? Okay.
I just quickly, I really liked the tidal power, but again, it's scale, right? If you were talking about kind of I know there's a project to replace the big 7 tidal system with lots of little smaller ones, but it's as soon as you get above a certain scale, again, it comes back to just the sheer impact and the sheer level that we need to do all these things at always seems to just push the bounds and cause the problems. But it's whole system, both in terms of technical analysis, making sure what are the real impacts on this, but doing the educating and the research to make sure we're understanding the true implications of these systems that we're building. So I think, I mean, hydropower's got so much going for it, but there are so many ongoing impacts in terms of other environmental impacts that you can cause by, you know, flooding a big valley and filling it full of water.
In case people didn't hear at home, the question was about, ideas of hydropower. I think that was clear. Any other questions from the audience? Conrad?
I had a question, sort of touched on businesses and technology. I was curious about investment either from the private side, sorry, or from the government side on infrastructure. So you know, we have all these electric cars. We plug every house, replace every car in the UK with an electric car and plug them all in at the same time. Would the grid actually be able to like handle that kind of load? So my question is, when you're trying to electrify the grid and scale that rest of that, how much of the additional investment required in infrastructure would be needed, and who would it come from? Would it come from commissioners, would it come from the government, or would it come from national grid itself?
So question on infrastructure, either public or private sector. Albina, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. So some of the investment comes from distribution network operators themselves. So they have budget to make improvements to the grid where they see that they are necessary. Some of that is then funded by projects. So if you have very big improvement works, when you have projects that are connecting to an area where, for example, you've improved an entire substation, then the first few projects would be paying for some of that reinforcement. It's worth noting that when this question of if we plugged in all the electric vehicles with the grid cope, yes, it will. That's and I think again around educating people, that question is very often asked, but the answer is not all of those vehicles would need to be charging all at the same time. So when we talk about in vehicle to grid is kind of the other side of it or the additionality of it. But when we talk about smart charging, what we're saying is you don't need to charge everything at the same time and have this risk of the grid struggling, because you can time how you do that. It's very difficult to time when people make their dinner or when they do a lot of other things. But charging an electric vehicle is actually not that difficult to manage in time. And again, what we do with in Octopus, we offer tariffs that either incentivize you yourself as a user to just charge during different times, so your energy is cheaper during certain windows, or we offer a service where we say, you tell me how charged you want your car to be, because maybe you don't want it fully charged like your phone every morning, and I will achieve that level of charge by a certain time in the morning. When I do it is up to me. Yeah, I will charge you an electric vehicle rate as if it was overnight, or maybe the majority of the charge will be overnight, but leave that up to me to do. And I guess the cherry on top when it comes to domestic technology, and we talk about vehicle to grid, where you can kind of do the counteraction of not just pulling energy, but also pushing it back. It's more challenging to put that onto the grid because of the issues that I've already described. But the additionality of that technology is that you no longer don't contribute to the peak anymore. You can also help make it lower. And again, what we do on our trial is we say, you plug in and leave us do whatever we want with the battery. Just tell me how charged you want it and by what time. But we kind of currently, at least, take away control from the user and take away the responsibility of having to decide and time their charge. When it comes to what level do we socialize that bill and that reinforcement more widely? At the moment, there is kind of a minimal amount. So if you're connecting anything less than 3.68 kilowatts onto the grid, so it might be solar, it might be V2G, it might be whatever, exporting assets. If you trigger need for reinforcement, which you might, that is paid and managed by the distribution network operator. So they will do the work, and that cost will be socialized to all consumers on the grid through distribution use of system charges. Anything above that amount, so every charger that we installed on our trial, because it was 7 kilowatts, if you trigger reinforcement, that responsibility falls on the consumer. And from our data, I can tell you that we have 100% refusal to pay reinforcement costs by an individual consumer. One, because it's very expensive. So our average, I think, was somewhere around £50,000. So that's out of pocket for you to pay for that substation to be upgraded, for you to pay for the road to be dug up, new cable to be laid. You might have to pay for traffic management during that time, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody wants to pay that. So what happens when you trigger that reinforcement is you block that technology in that particular location. And it might be in places where a lot of people already have renewables. So we have cases where all of your neighbors have solar. Well, bad luck, you should have come into the renewable world earlier, too bad for you. And in other areas, it's because the grid is not reinforced or hasn't been reinforced in a long time. So maybe you're very close to a transformer or to a substation or a transformer that is very small. But the last thing that and I will pass on, the last thing that I would say is in a lot of cases on the low voltage network, we trigger reinforcement, which is based on modeling from the DNO on a worst case scenario basis. So they say, what is the worst thing that can happen if I connect this technology and if it's exporting also during the sunniest weekend in the UK when all of the solar is exporting and everything is just in pushing to the grid and we have a problem. Now, that is based on very little data because the low voltage network is data poor. So one of the things that we are pushing for, and that requires investment, and actually there are DNOs that are using their innovation and network budget to fund this, is to get more granular data on the LV network. Because from my feeling and what I've seen on the grid is a lot of those substations that say are constrained actually probably aren't, and 7 kilowatts won't kill you. So, well, not kill you, 7 kilowatts might hurt you, but 7, yeah, it won't cause a blackout on your street. So that level of investment and kind of putting money to get more data is really important. And I think distribution network operators should put that money on the table rather than asking consumers to do that work. And the other thing is, what we found kind of fascinating was, well, when we apply in areas and you tell me there's a need for reinforcement, what do you do with that information? So if I say this customer needs to reinforce, they've refused to reinforce, does the DNO then target that area and reinforce it later? Or what do they do? Some DNOs take that information away and say, thank you very much for this free research on my network capability. I shall work with that later. And some DNOs probably don't do anything. And I think there's a problem in that part of the energy world of, let's do business as usual because that's easy. We have long SLAs that everyone hates, but that's how we work. We might be understaffed and we don't have enough capacity for more, but we have processes that we can follow and they work. Business as usual, when we want to get to net zero, doesn't work, especially on a network level. So we've really pushed on the SLAs of DNOs, the funding of the DNOs. We've shouted and screamed about this reinforcement cost on domestic V2G charging a lot, to the point where, one, the application process for vehicle to grid specifically changed. Vehicle to grid actually became its own technology. So before it wasn't, it was kind of a battery and kind of an electric vehicle. And we were saying, well, it's not either of those really. So make a technology class for that. And we are talking a lot to DNOs and the Energy Network Association, which is kind of above all the DNOs, to challenge that limit. Why is it 3.68 kilowatts that doesn't trigger reinforcement? And there are conversations currently happening about maybe raising that limit. If you raise it, how much do you raise it to? Who pays? You know, does it go on to everyone's bill? So I think network reinforcement is a very sensitive topic. It's a very important topic. But if I had to pick an area to say, well, put money there before you put any money on the bills, would be on simply just LV data availability. Know your network better and really target the reinforcement where it's needed based on science based on the data from your own network.
Thank you, Alvana.
yeah,
Very
that was a
interesting.
very long-
No, don't worry.
Anyone?
Julia or Roger, would you like to add anything?
I'd only add that I think what Albana said is illustrates a really difficult question about net zero, which is who pays? Because DNOs are not putting their money in. DNOs are reaching a settlement with Ofgem about how much they can charge you to put their money in. So it's a complicated old business, and we really have to think about around where we are shifting effective subsidy from poor people to rich people. I used to sit on the UK Power Network's customer engagement panel, which I assure you was deeply dull, and as a piece of career advice, don't do it. But you know, one of you know, and this is all about the network, the people who literally run the wires that go to your house. Those people. It was about how much should they be allowed to spend on putting in the cabling to enable lots and lots of domestic car charging. But and this is not, I'm pro electric vehicles, but broadly speaking, better off people have electric cars. broadly speaking, worse off people don't have electric cars. And so the cost of that cabling is totally socialized. It's on everybody's electricity bill. And this whole thing around who is paying for what in the world of net zero needs radical rethinking. But because it's highly political, I'm not quite sure who will have the appetite for the radical rethinking.
I just add, it's so tricky, like 1 million electric vehicles, 7 kilowatt chargers, 7 gigawatts of flex, even if that's just vehicle to grid or just just one way. That's an incredible amount of flex and an incredible opportunity. But then again, it generates revenue for the people who own the electric cars and makes it cheaper for them to run, which again is like causing this discrepancy of who pays. So I think it's like probably the key question about who pays for this stuff and how do we make sure that it's fair.
Perfect, thank you. So I don't want to finish this session with a question, who pays? So I want to go back to that diversity and I guess the electricity mix we need for to plug in and for this power sector. So I would like to finish, because our time is about to run out, the session by asking each of the speakers a very quick, easy question on how the mix of the power sector would look in the future. In a net zero scenario, can be 2050, 2100, whatever. How much, well, I have my doubts anyway, but whenever we reach net zero, what's the percentage, well, obviously broadly speaking, of if you're pro-nuclear, nuclear, CCGTs, renewables, solar or wind, and if you believe that, or if you think we're still going to have CCGTs and have then the air carbon capturing to contribute. So broadly speaking, how would be the split of that energy mix in our grid in the UK, considering obviously the resources we have? I know it's a tricky one. Just feel free to come up with one. It doesn't have to add up to 100.
I'll go first. I think it will be about 20% nuclear, which is what it is today. And I think that it will be about 70% renewables, which is obviously a vast expansion of what it is today. And I think that the rest of the mix will be filled in by developing technologies, possibly CCGTs, but only if there is successful carbon capture and storage, and only if everybody gets really happy with that level of dependence on security of supply. I don't think we will continue to get a huge volume of electricity through interconnection because there's big weather correlation between Northern Europe countries, unsurprisingly. And so broadly speaking, there's a high correlation between it not being windy here and it not being windy in France, etc. So I think there'll be some interconnection, but not very much as those countries increasingly decarbonize their own grids.
Okay. And I'm gonna go optimistic. I'd say inevitably there will probably be some nuclear, probably somewhere between 10 and 15%. And I would go with the rest of it being fully renewable. That's my hope, supported by large amounts of battery storage and perhaps most importantly, long-term battery storage and a very large and lucrative flexibility market.
Yeah, baseload. There is going to be some nuclear. I think we're on that path now. I think we're going to have, in terms of installed generation, it's going to be 200-300%, wind and solar, just in order to provide us with the amount of energy we need. I think that's going to be combined with a energy vector such as a synthetic fuel like hydrogen or ammonia. I'm not going to gamble on which one it is, but there seems to be a huge kind of growing momentum with hydrogen at the moment. It kills me on that because of the efficiencies involved in generating hydrogen and then actually burning it to get it back. However, if you've got a huge amount of renewables, then efficiencies aren't such a big issue. So I think there's going to be a huge amount of demand side response helping to balance, but the interseasonal storage is going to be that we need. It's going to be provided by an energy vector and lots of kind of innovative energy storage technologies.
Thank you. He missed the percentage bit. I know it's a tricky one, but thank you so much for trying to answer this one. And I guess we'll see how it goes. And our time is over for the first session. We're going to have a quick 10-minute break and we'll go on to how we make things next with Josh moderating. So thank you so much. And thank you. I'll just Hello. Okay, so I think we're ready for session 2. I'll just ask everyone to please get their seats. We're about to start session 2. We're gonna have a speaker connecting remotely this time, so please bear with us. And we've done a lot of testing, so hopefully things will run smoothly. We have Selena joining with us remotely, and there she is. And we have Dr. Pierre and Matt with us as well in person. I'll leave it to Josh then, and one speaker for you to share.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for being here, and thanks Drew for doing the first session. I thought it was a really interesting discussion on how we plug in, and now I'd like to take us on a little bit of a discussion on how we make things. So I'll be moderating this session, and my name is Josh Fernandez. I'm manager of electrification at Octopus Energy, working on electrification projects to decarbonize businesses. I've only been there for about 2 months, so don't ask me too many questions. I don't really know what I'm doing. That's a joke. And lucky enough to be joined today by Dr. Pierre I still can't pronounce your surname, Frizio, and also Matt Langham and Lantham. So we had a session earlier, and we were terrible at myself and Matt were terrible at actually pronouncing everyone's names. So I apologize in advance for that. So if that happens again, I'm really sorry. And we're also joined by Selena Molina from Vattenfall, and Pierre, of course, Dr. Pierre from Imperial Environmental Policy Research
Center for
Environmental Policy. Apologies, it's kicking off to a great start. So how we make things, the way we're kind of going to discuss this session is kind of breaking it down into just sort of 3 sections, which is around sort of plastics, cement and steel. So, with cement being about roughly in the world, there's about a ton or half a ton of cement that's made for every single person in the world every year. So it's a considerable amount of resource, the second only to clean water as a consumable resource or a consumable product in the world. Similarly, steel, about 0.3 tons for every single person in the planet made every year, considerable amount. And plastics, as we all know, the scourge on our environment, but we just need to figure out a way to actually use them better and make them better. So I'd like to start off with allowing Dr. Pierre, Matt and Selena to introduce themselves and a little bit about what they're working on at the moment, and then we'll go into a discussion. So Dr. Pierre, over to you.
I like the Dr. Piera. So hi all, my name is Piera. Now I guess you figured it out. I'm a research associate at the Center for Environmental Policy here at Imperial College. I work mainly, I'm not a big expert on cement, but I work on different decarbonization strategies for industries as well as the power sector. My main focus is CDR technology, so all the technology that actually capture and remove carbon from the atmosphere, such as BECCS, DAC, and so on, and how they can be integrated in the system. And then over the last 2 years, I've been doing also some feasibility assessment on the pathways for decarbonizing cements and steel as well.
Okay, hi everyone. Yeah, my name's Matthew, and I work for an Enco who's sponsoring this event. So thank you very much to my guys. Yeah, talking about plastics today. For my job, I'm a solutions engineer, so it's mostly carbon compliance. So I understand a lot of you are probably working on the hardware side of things, the actual tech, implementing it, buying the land or whatever it is you do. Thank you for being here and for coming along. What I do is just kind of energy management, carbon compliance, that kind of thing. So, I go to sites, I assess them, I write reports, etc. It's a lot of fun. I like it. That's basically it from me. Nice and short. Hope you enjoy it.
Thanks, Matt. And then Selena is joining us now from Stockholm. So we've got an international discussion happening today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Selena Molina. I work for Vattenfall Heat UK in London. But Vattenfall is a Swedish energy company, and I'm on rotation for 3 months in Stockholm right now. And I'm on rotation on the R&D team, which is the team that started Hybrid 6 years ago. Hybrid is the first fossil-free, like full fossil-free steel project right now in Europe. There's many other pilot plants, but last summer we produced the first steel, which is now being used in Volvo cars and some nice sculptures and some souvenirs. So it's real, it works. And I'm here learning about not only this, how to decarbonize the steel industry, but all other heavy industry processes like aviation fuel, chemical refineries, etc.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Selena. So if I could start the discussion and kind of giving a little bit of context. I'm going to ask my speakers each to kind of give a little bit of a broad overview and a context of each of those three main areas. So that plastics, the cement, and the steel. So between those three, something around sort of 20–25% of the sort of global carbon emissions of that 51 billion, and then the additions of aluminium and glass are kind of smaller proportions of that. So really focusing on that steel, cement, and plastic for today. So if I could just perhaps ask Dr. Pierre to kind of give a little bit of a brief overview of the sort of cement and why that's what are the challenges. So from my perspective, why can't we've got renewables, is that just going to solve everything, or what are the challenges in actually decarbonizing something like cement or steel or plastics? And I'll just hand over to each of you. No.
Yes. Okay, so so as you said, basically cement is responsible for around, I think, a quarter of global CO2 emission. And as you rightfully said, it's everywhere. And it's an essential element actually of our life. The 2/3 of the emission from cement production are generated from the calcination of limestone, because limestone, which is quite of an available material, is used for producing cement. And this is where actually the emission comes from. So these are emissions that are released in the atmosphere. So even if you switch fuel, as you were suggesting, and using renewable, this is not going to solve the problem. So there are different ways for decarbonizing the industry that have been proposed because, as I guess you guys know, we are trying to reach net zero emission by 2050, and cement needs to be part of the solution. Knowing, of course, that in developing countries, most probably the cement production is going to decline because we already kind of like have a lot of end-of-life concrete that we can recycle. But in some developing countries, actually, we're going to see a growth. And of course, developing countries are also the ones that are less alternative for producing cement at a cheaper competitive price. So the avenues, let's say, for decarbonizing cement are, first of all, switching fuel. So you could use, for instance, waste biomass for producing energy that then drives the calcination process. But as I said, this is gonna chuck down just a little bit of emission. And also you need to have biomass available around, which, as we know, it's an issue because biomass is going to be needed in different decarbonization pathways, such as, for instance, bioenergy production, and then you have the land competition with food and so on. So this is the first option. The other option is to reduce the clinker content. So cement is made of around, like, conventional Portland cement is made of 75% of clinker, and then you have 25% of SCM. So these are alternative materials such as, for instance, blast furnace or ash. And you can actually reduce the ratio, but up to a certain point because you have structural problem otherwise. So again, this is another solution, but it's not going to cut emission up to zero as we need. And then the third option, which is the one that we need to explore and push, is carbon capture and storage. So capturing the CO2 and then eventually transporting and storing underground. The fourth option would be, there is of course also energy efficiency, which is kind of like trying to have some avenues for heat recovery. But again, the issue is that energy efficiency is going to contribute, but not more than 4% generally. And then the other option would be try to find innovative solutions, such as, for instance, carbonation, in which you actually capture CO2 and then you put this CO2, you carbonate the material, then include that material within cement. So these are the options overall.
Brilliant. So a lot of,
Sorry.
not just the fuel you're actually using, but actually how you make, actually changing the chemical makeup of the material itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. So a bigger industrial challenge
It is,
from a
yeah.
process perspective.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, CCS has its own challenge.
Yeah.
One of which being the fact that cement is born before CCS. So most of the time, the cement plants are not located close to a storage, and then you have all of the transport problem and logistic. But yeah, these are the options.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks so much. That was a great overview. Maybe over to Matt for some sort of plastics in general.
Yeah. So I'll tell you a bit of a story about plastics. So who knows when plastics first were invented? Anyone? No? It was around 1907. Plastics were invented by a Belgian chemist named Leo Baekeland. Excuse me if I'm just reading off my notes here, so that's memorize. So at the time, plastics were seen as a good, cheap, reliable material, but with many uses. But the way they were seen over time sort of changed. We realized that they had very tough biodegradability, taking hundreds of years to decompose. Since 1950, about 9 billion tons of plastic have been produced, and 381 million tons annually. I mean, wow, I can't even comprehend those figures. Currently, 9% of production is recycled and 12% is incinerated. This leaves about 80%, which either goes to landfill or ends up in oceans and rivers and natural environments, with the Yangtze River being the highest contributor in terms of pollution, discharging about 1.5 million tons annually into the LSE. So that's, I could go on, but do you want?
Yeah, I mean, maybe discussing in terms of the core challenge in the plastic, is just having the tools that we've got on the toolkit, saying, for example, how we plug in decarbonizing our electricity mix. Cool, we've got renewable energy. Is that going to solve plastics, or is there a wider, for example, in cement, is that something which you're going to need to change the chemistry or inherently change how you actually do those processes to enable to decarbonize them? Is carbon capture something which you could get engaged with from a plastics industry, or is that something which would not be too viable?
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, when you're going upstream with plastics from when they're made from crude oil, there is potential for carbon capture and storage. There's potential there for the way that the heat's generated, because a lot of it is to do with raising steam, and it can come from cracking. Sorry if you used for cracking, things like that. That can come from hydrogen. But what I see when I go on site is mostly electric heaters. They use screws to push the plastic pellets along a cylinder or a tube, which is then heated by electric heaters, and that's mostly how it's done. It's electrically heated. So yeah, I think that for carbon capture and storage, there's not such potential on a manufacturing site level, but for electrification, sort of zero carbon electrification, there definitely is potential there. But then I don't know if the owners would lie on the manufacturers or the grid experts, So yeah, and then again, there's a problem with pollution. So there's alternatives to a lot of plastic products out there, and I think that a lot of people are being more interested in that now, such as I saw on sort of a LinkedIn video or something about a shampoo bottle that's made out of solid soap. I think things like that, instead of plastic, I think things like that will become more popular, and biodegradable plastics. But with plastics, they're so smart at it now, you can basically get a plastic to do anything. When I was in school, actually, they had a lecture on, I think it was actually at Imperial or something, but it was on a plastic which could be used as a TV screen. Now that hasn't been scaled up for some reason, but you know, if there's that much drive to make plastic which is decomposable, then I think there's potential for reducing the pollution. And also, yeah, in terms of the energy, I think it mostly depends on the mix in the grid, as well as, you know, the upstream carbon capture and storage. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's it for me. So going on.
All right, no, thanks very much, Matt. Okay, and then for Selena, from a perspective of steel.
Yeah. So the as you said before, well, it's around 2,000 million tons of carbon a year, so of steel a year. So it's as you said, like 0.3 tons per person, which is a lot. And each ton of steel has 1.6 or 1.2 or 1.8 tons of carbon associated with it. So it's a huge amount of carbon that it's emitted in the process of building carbon. So not like plastics where the carbon is embedded in the plastic itself. Steel doesn't have that much carbon embedded in it. It all comes from the production. Around 70 to 75% of the steel in the world is produced by blast furnaces. Then there's a 20%, which is 6%, sorry, produced by electric arc furnace and direct reduced iron, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And 20-25% is produced by electric arc furnaces with scrap steel. So there's already a lot of reusing of steel or recycling of steel. So recycled steel used as a feedstock for new steel, but still 70 to 75% of it is produced in blast furnaces. That process emits carbon in two steps. One is the reduction of iron. So iron comes from the mine in a pure form. It has oxygen embedded in it. And as all of us know, we don't want oxygen in our steel because it could corrode quite easily. So before building steel, that iron is reduced, which means you remove the oxygen content from the iron. How that's normally done is with coal in a blast furnace. So pulverized coal is put in like a high temperature, high pressure vessel with the iron, and that carbon takes the oxygen out of the iron, producing CO2. So that's the first CO2 emission. And that CO2 is not captured, it's just emitted to the atmosphere. Then the second step is to melt that iron to produce steel, which is normally done in furnaces that can also be fueled by coal. So it's all coal, both in the reduction, so reducing the oxygen content, and in the melting. Ways to decarbonize that process are to obviously use carbon capture on both processes, but it requires large scale carbon capture storage, is way more expensive, and it's still like a technology of the future, let's say. The other way is you can still reduce that iron with carbon, but melt it in an electric arc furnace, basically using an electric arc to melt the iron, and that would mean you use renewable electricity, you would reduce the carbon a little bit. The other way of reducing further the carbon is to do direct reduced iron, which is removing the oxygen with hydrogen instead of carbon. So the byproduct is water. If that hydrogen comes from fossil fuels, the total content of carbon reduces from 1.6 to 0.6. So still is already a very good reduction. But if you use hydrogen generated with electrolysis from, again, renewable power, you reduce it to 0.02, almost zero emissions. So that's the kind of the journey that we can go through from current 70-75% of the steel being produced with coal blast furnace to renewable power, hydrogen reduction plus electric arc furnace, which can get almost to zero carbon steel. Challenges to that, many. it's technology that is not proven. It's pilot plants like the one Vattenfall is working on and some other companies. Most of the carbon comes from the steel, sorry, comes from China. More than 50% of the production. If China were to electrify their processes, China's grid is 700 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So it's not green electricity. And even in countries where you do have some renewable power, it requires a lot of extra electricity. The process consumes a lot of electricity. So you need more renewable electricity, better and bigger transmission grids, and ways to find to produce hydrogen, like the electrolyzers need to also scale up and get more mature. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. So that's covered quite a lot in a short space of time. So thanks very much for our speakers for that. So in the Bill Gates book, some of the things which he summarizes at the end of each chapter is sort of his thinking of kind of main points to decarbonize that sector. So in the area of how we make things, that chapter, he discusses four main points, which is 1, electrification. 2 is decarbonizing that electricity as much as possible. 3 is carbon capture and storage. And then 4th is efficient use of materials. So either through the actual minimization of requirement for those materials or for energy efficiency within those. So on those 4 points, I'd just like to kind of go to the panel and say, you know, what your opinion on those? Is there anything within those which you think is missing completely? For example, new types of processes, or you know, research required to invest in new types of technologies, or say, is there something prevalent within that? We touched on carbon capture a little bit. Maybe if what would be your priority out of those 4, or is the priority something else in your view?
Should I talk about cement?
Yeah,
or...
I mean, feel free to talk about cement, or you're also an expert in several other of these topics. So feel free to discuss on any which you like.
Okay, so well, I don't think Bill Gates is missing anything for sure. I'm not gonna be adding anything to what Bill Gates said. I think it's actually like those are actually the main, let's say, area of improvement and way for reaching net zero. In terms of, okay, let's talk about cement. So in the case of cement, electrification doesn't apply because, as I said, the problem is on the release of CO2 from the process, as well as using renewables or having a decarbonized electricity or grid. I think that unlike steel, as we heard, capturing CO2 from the process is much easier because blast furnaces, I mean, the direct route, the integrated steam mills for iron are basically characterized by different CO2 streams, and the CO2 is also at a different concentration. And that's the big issue because when you apply CCS to a blast furnace, you basically at the end cut only 60% of emission, even if you're assuming a 90% capture efficiency. And the reason is that you have different CO2 stream because the process is very, very complex. And also the CO2 is at different concentration. In the case of cement, this is not happening because you basically have only one point source and you can capture easily. The problem, as I said before, is that it really depends on where the CO2 storage is, because cement producers are already working with very tiny margins. And so the CO2 transport is actually impacting on the production. So if they can, for instance, share an infrastructure, because generally they're also located close by, then it might be an option. Otherwise, when CCS is not applicable, I think carbonation is another option. So as I said before, the idea of taking, for instance, end-of-life concrete, crushing it, and then applying these carbonations where you incorporate CO2. It doesn't, nobody is hearing.
Sorry.
And then you basically incorporate some CO2 in the cement, in the final cement. And this, I think, can work, for instance, in developing countries. The challenge is, again, is that you need to have products available, and the transport of this product needs to be reduced because logistic is impacting a lot in the economic of the solution. So these, I would say, are the option.
And that from your perspective, you've worked on or are currently working on sort of a greenhouse gas removal that clustering kind of approach, right?
Yes.
Through your work. So is that something which you're seeing as kind of a necessity in terms of showing that carbon capture infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what is happening now with the industrial cluster in the UK is exactly the same. So they're doing it because it's possible to share the infrastructure. So you are decarbonizing more than one industry at once. And already CCS is bearing a lot of problems also in terms of commercial risk and bankability and so on. So you really need to have a plan and more than like a rollout plan, knowing that more than one industry is going to join. Otherwise, there's no way that one single plant would just install CCS and do that.
And forgive my ignorance here, but I'm assuming that there's no actual plant in existence today which has got carbon capture.
No, there are.
There are?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so carbon capture is actually at the moment it's used in the US mainly for enhanced soil recovery. So
I meant in the cement steel manufacturing.
I mean, there are some pilot plants and there are some plants that are doing BECCS, so bioenergy combined with CCS in the US. So the idea of BECCS is the idea of getting negative emission because you're basically sequestrating biological CO2 from the biomass, and then you are sequestrating underground. So basically you get to net less than zero. And this is what we actually need if we want to reach any of the targets from the Paris Agreement. We basically need to remove. So BECCS is becoming very popular, and there are various projects in the US that use bioethanol, and then they do they sequester carbon. I think US also has the tax incentive in place. So I think actually US and UK are going to be the two places where this is we're gonna see that. Yeah.
Thanks, Piera. Really interesting. So yeah, electrify every process possible. Bill Gates says it's going to take a lot of innovation. I'd agree with that. I'd say for plastics, it's mostly kind of at least plastic manufacturing. I'm not talking about, getting out of crude oil, but yeah, for plastic manufacturing, it is mostly all electrified anyway, a lot of it. So I'd agree with that. I'd say it's already actually there mostly in a lot of plastic manufacturers. You can get things like gas boilers, which could be converted to hydrogen potentially, or electric boilers or heaters or heat pumps or something to get hot water for those few sites where they don't use electric heaters. But yeah, then get that electricity from a power grid that's decarbonized. I would agree with that. Bill Gates admits it's going to take a lot of innovation. So yeah, an investment and workers and all this stuff, which currently we're maybe a bit short of potentially. But I think that's possible, definitely, that's just my opinion. Use carbon capture to observe remaining emissions. As I said before, most of the processes are already electrified within plastic manufacturing. So using carbon capture there will be maybe kind of limited for those sites I've seen, but using it upstream, as I said before, would probably, be fine. And lastly, use materials more efficiently. Yep, I'd agree with that. The only thing is for plastics is that can have knock-on effects with other ways that the site performance can be measured. So for instance, for one of my clients, one of my sites, which I won't get into right now, it's confidential, they reported production as materials coming in, but then they recycled more later on. So that means that you've got less that you need to buy in. So essentially their production was going down, but their energy was staying the same. So you've got a higher kilowatt hour per ton, if that makes sense. And that basically would mean they'd have to pay a lot of money potentially because they wouldn't meet their target. So things like that problems like that is sort of the fun things that I get to deal with in my job. And it's easily fixed. It's just, a different way of reporting production. Yeah, so that's basically my take on it. Thanks, Josh. Over to you.
Thanks, Matt. And yeah, Selena.
I'll be quick. I think I would start with the reducing the amount of materials we use. That's the first on all the materials. It's not only steel, but I think that should be your first objective. Reduce, be more efficient in the way we use resources. I guess it's back to kind of like a circular economy kind of thing. If we need new materials, so try to reduce the amount of materials we use, reuse materials when we can. So either back to for example, the steel scraps going back to the furnace to be melted again and be transformed into new steel again. That's one way, but there's ways to reutilize materials. But also going back to the design of the materials, so make them in a way that can be easily recyclable. So Pira said before that you can also use end-of-life concrete to be reused in the kernels. It's like, yes, let's make all concrete usable at their end of life, not just that 20% or whatever we're getting now. So, and it's the same with plastics and with steel and other materials. Try to get to a more efficient use of the risk, get a lot of life cycles out of 1 ton of material rather than building new one would be my key point. And then electrify, etc.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, a broad range of topics discussed so far, and various solutions from electrification to carbon capture to actually changing the chemical processes inherently of those products. At this point, I'd like to open it out for discussion in the general audience. If there's anything you would like to add or challenge or question, or specifically perhaps around views on new technologies that are available. Anyone in the is it Belissa? Bellama, sorry. I'll come and chuck this microphone to you.
Thank you. I think my question is mostly towards Selena. I wanted to ask about how receptive is the iron and steel industry towards hydrogen for direct reduction of iron, and what sort of a policy framework is hybrids kind of looking forward to pushing to ensure the uptake, increased market penetration of the technology.
Very good questions. In terms of the steel producers' appetite, the steel quality doesn't change. So it's not as if you're changing intrinsically the quality of the material. The reduced iron is the same quality, and electric arc furnaces produce the same quality steel as a blast furnace. So there shouldn't be a concern in terms of steel quality. In terms of price, there's obviously an extra price per ton of steel, which depends on obviously the price of the electricity and the maturity of the technologies we're using. So that will go down. And also if you have renewable electricity, maybe directly connected to the plant or with direct PPAs, it shouldn't be an issue. So to me, I think the biggest challenge is that we're starting with these pilots in Europe, and especially in Sweden and the Nordic countries where the grid is already very cheap electricity, very low carbon, so easy. Obviously, you have to start somewhere, but we have to go from, and also Europe produces 7% or 8% of the total steel produced in the world. So it's a drop in the ocean. Very good steps, but it's how do we look at China and the bigger producer, which is China's 50%, then is India with maybe 10, 15, but China is the key one, which I guess goes into policies. The issue there is that each country is different. So that's something haven't got my head around on how to influence from a world level. I guess it would be more easier to do it from an industry level, like that. Either you cannot export your there's like a carbon border tax or carbon tax at the border concept, where even if other countries don't have carbon emission policies, you get your you charge them when they enter your country, basically. So they have an incentive
Tariff-based
to
structure, so a
again?
tariff-based structure based on carbon, right?
Exactly. So it's just to balance out the market. Say that in the UK we put some carbon price onto our materials, which make them more expensive, and that would drive people to consume steel from China, let's say, because China doesn't have those taxes and those extra costs. We put a tax at the border, basically. That could be a way of doing it. But it would be great to find a way to incentivize them as well to decarbonize it. But I don't know. I don't have an answer.
Thanks, Selena. Perhaps open that kind of question discussion on the panel as well. Perhaps Pierre, I know you've done sort of some looking at how CBAMs or carbon border adjustment mechanisms, how those might sort of impact socially, or if those are possible. Maybe you've got some, open for whatever your opinions are.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done that much research on carbon border adjustment, but so one thing that I would say on the DRI routes, the problem is existing plants, right? Because in Europe we have a lot of blast furnace around, and one issue is, it's a completely different technology, so you need to dismantle what you have and then build something else. And you also have social problem, right? Because it's very much so the integrated steel mills employ a lot of people. They are big plants, so you're going to have employment problem, and it's not like a switch from day and night. I think in terms of investment or incentives, I mean, in the UK now, I mean, they're talking a lot about carbon removal markets, right? So there is a lot that is going on paying people for removing carbon. I mean, I'm talking only about my expertise, and CCS might be one of it. For hydrogen, I mean, in Europe, green hydrogen is now like within the European policy framework. So I think it's most probably going to happen. And then once green hydrogen is in place, then that means that we are decarbonized, and then we can more easily have this type of technology at zero carbon, I think.
Did you want to add anything to that, Matt?
No, thanks.
Okay. I'll pass on to G, our esteemed YPN chairman.
Thank you. I will discuss a bit. My question is related more to my area, that is generation. And I think from the perspective, the way we built the grid was focused on utility scale. And I think what we're seeing the green hydrogen perspective is kind of the same. Whether is it possible from your experience, Pierre, for example, where you share the CCS technology in that cluster, that we're going to move, for example, industrial clusters to also focus on building the generation, putting the electrolyzer there, rather than thinking that you're going to build the green hydrogen where it's cheaper and transport and make it inefficient in the way that it is. And I think this is the biggest challenge that we have. Like when you see the concentration is how you bring the electricity to generate there. And you could be more efficient when you're selling through a PPA, but these traditional industries are still focused on the way that I own the investment and I want the return for myself, rather than making the most efficient way. That could be sharing the grid, sharing the generation, sharing the electrolyzer, sharing the carbon capture part, and focus on the core production that is the bread and butter that they are experts on. And they then could focus the investments on decarbonizing the process and the material, and leave the rest for the rest of the chain that are more experts than them, and deliver this efficiency. So from your experience on the cement, but also Celine and Matt, on the manufacturing plants that you have experience with.
Thank you, Guy. That's a very interesting question. Yeah, I'm not an expert on like green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, transporting hydrogen, etc. But I know that there are definitely, in general, hydrogen replacing gas is kind of one thing. What would be the price of hydrogen then? I think it'd be probably a fair bit more expensive than gas, wouldn't it? I mean, yeah, so there's economies of scale there. As the previous panel speaker said, then it comes down to as well, who's going to pay for that? You know, I think that they are implementing hydrogen in some industrial clusters in the north. There's some networks up there. Whether or not that's going to take off has yet to be seen, but I, really think that's very, kind of forward thinking of them. There's an issue with energy security as well. You might have alluded to, which is to transportation, but also from gas. Do we want to be kind of, investing in foreign companies and foreign sources of these fossil fuels, or do we want to be kind of making our own? That's a good question. So yeah, basically, I think there is some potential for it to be scaled up in industry, but not with everything. I don't think with everything. I think some things have to be, you have to change it to electric or find some other way of sort of kind of powering it, or it could even be from just, on-site renewables, different processes, etc. So yeah, I hope that answered your question satisfactorily.
If I might paraphrase from my understanding of G's question, it was kind of like, should cement producers, should plastic manufacturers, should big industrial users be thinking holistically about their decarbonisation? So should they be engaging in building a new renewable site solely for my steel manufacturing, or building a hydrogen electrolyzer? Or should they be thinking, actually, I'm not going to do anything until I've got someone that can come and build me CCS and a project there, or I'm not going to do anything until I've got an active source of green hydrogen or blue hydrogen that someone's going to build next door? Is that from my understanding? So yeah, who should be playing cat and mouse on that responsibility?
Well, that's a good question. A great question. I mean, I think maybe we can start by looking at the industrial cluster in the UK, right? So, I mean, we have 5 or 6 big industrial clusters that needs to be decarbonized, and the UK government has launched the UK Industrial Decarbonization Challenge, and based on that, all the, these companies and these industries were actually submitting proposals saying, this is what we want to do, this is how we can decarbonize, please fund us. So there's no way that an industry is going to pay for putting the hydrogen technology and pay for it. But as you said, it needs to be shared. There is, of course, a distinction to make between blue hydrogen and green hydrogen, in the sense that UK is going for blue hydrogen because, again, it is going to use it from natural gas and then producing it and then using the CCS, because also there is storage around, and because UK has experience of CCS since over 20 years. Europe is going for a green hydrogen. That means that it's going to be produced via electrolysis, and the challenge is going to be the scale up of all the infrastructure, because the demand is just going to, like, for industries, the demand is going to of hydrogen is going to be crazy. And I think if I remember correctly, you need 25 kilowatt-hour per hydrogen per kilogram of hydrogen produced. So it's really a lot. And if you converted this out back for the renewable, it's just a lot. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Selena, is anything you'd like to add on that one?
Yeah, no, I agree with Piera said, and to the question from the audience, I think these big industry producers will not want to build themselves the generation capacity, mainly because it's not their expertise. They may want to invest in it as an investment opportunity, but it's probably better to partner with the companies, like partner with the electrolyzer company, partner with a CCS company, partner with a wind farm building and operations company that have that expertise and share the revenues rather than building it themselves. And I think that kind of like partnership approach, it's also a good way to solve that chicken and egg situation of the utility company or the electrolyzer company says, I'm not going to scale up my production, or I'm not going to build a new huge wind farm here if there's no demand. And the industrial clusters will say, I'm not going to decarbonize my processes if I don't have the green hydrogen, CCS at cheap prices, whatever. But if they work together, I think that's what could work. I think that the challenge of that is that every project is going to be different. There's many different ways of partnering, but I guess from the policy perspective, finding ways to enable that easily in terms of permits, in terms of R&D, to scale up those, to like trial that partnership and then scale it up, could be the way to cluster both the generation and the production.
I hope that answers your question, G. So just mindful of time, looking to wrap up here. It's been a really interesting discussion. Thanks very much, all three of you, for joining, and everyone for attentively listening, and some of your questions as well. Really interesting. I just want to wrap up with sort of one question in general, really, which is, we've talked about some of the different approaches, different solutions, and obviously attached to all of those is going to be additional cost, additional infrastructure, and additional will and investment required. So just on a very sort of broad scale, would you say you're optimistic that we'll be able to get to a net zero sort of future in these manufacturing areas, or do you think it's in the too hard to do bucket?
Does this include offsetting of CO2 emissions, or like you mean like the production?
Yeah, I think holistically,
All right, I like this holistic approach. Yeah, I think it's the only way is to, I mean, for me, for what I think, reaching net zero emission of cement, net zero steel, net zero plastic is not going to be possible. And most probably what is going to happen is that companies are going to pay for offsetting their emission via planting tree, investing in direct air capture and all of that stuff, because there are going to be removal technologies that remove the CO2, while I don't think it's possible. I mean, we have 30 years, less than 30 years, so no.
Okay, very clear pessimistic view on that.
I don't think our view is pessimistic. Yeah, I kind of agree with my fellow speaker here. Yeah, I think that we're ingrained now in kind of like using fossil fuels, and there's going to be a lot of greenwashing. A lot of companies don't want to pay the extra money to go green unless there's a financial incentive. It's all run off money, basically, and traditionally money, the way it worked with energy and manufacturing was it was all geared off of fossil fuels, doing things cheaply, mass producing things, etc. That way of thinking has got to change if we want to, meet our targets. Not sure if we will meet it or not. I'm going to say, just for the argument's sake, I think we will. I think we will. I think the government, at least, the governments around the world.
One thing is meeting the target. The other is decarbonizing plastic.
Yeah.
So,
all right. Decarbonizing plastic. Yeah. I think you can probably meet that target. Yeah.
And Celine?
I'm optimistic.
Yay.
Yes, it's all about money, but it's also about consumers, and as one of the past panelists said, it's about making it sexy. And I think sustainability is becoming very sexy, and consumers and customers are going to demand it. It will take a while to find the solutions, but I think if you look back in 30 years ago, I think we didn't have phones, the internet wasn't used. So we will find solutions that we're not even discussing right now in the next 30 years, which will accelerate the decarbonization potential. So I'm optimistic.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. And I would definitely echo that optimistic sentiment, whether naively or not, and especially around that if we think of the transformation around technologies for electric vehicles, for example, and the way that the passenger vehicles, light duty, heavy duty, perhaps in the construction as well, is going to be changing into electric, where you have that will and that demand that you can flip an entire auto manufacturing industry on its head, just from having one challenger really taking the lead, and perhaps follow on Vattenfall, SSAB, and then the hybrid might be that one, and still, who knows. But thank you very much all for your opinions and for your thoughts and discussion, and we'll end it there. So thanks so much everyone for listening. Please eat as many of the snacks and the drinks you can, because Shannon and I hold that all the way over here. So please do enjoy them, and hang around and just chill out, and feel free to hang here as long as you like. And yeah, thanks very much.